I stood frozen in the middle of my backyard, staring at 4 massive rain barrels that had all been drained bone dry overnight. Not a single drop left. Just last evening they were full, collecting runoff from the storm that finally broke our month-long drought. Now the sun beat down on cracked dirt where my garden used to thrive, while from the other side of the fence I heard the faint hiss of sprinklers and the sound of someone humming. I followed the sound like a bloodhound and found Karen. Yes, that Karen, sipping a lemonade, lounging on a white deck chair with her feet up. Her entire yard glistened green, like it had rained just for her. A hose lay stretched out across our shared fence line. One end disappeared behind her hydrangeas, the other still dripping beside my bone-dry barrels. She smiled when she saw me, not sheepishly, not guilty, but smug. When I asked if she took my water, she shrugged and said, "Your rain wasn't being used. Mine was. Fair's fair." That's when I realized I was going to war. The drought had already brought out the worst in people. We live in one of those semi-rural communities where everyone likes to pretend they're neighborly, but secretly counts how many inches your grass grows past HOA limits. The county had issued a level 3 restriction 2 weeks earlier. No lawn watering, no car washing, no filling kiddie pools. You could only water your garden with recycled water or rain capture. So I did the responsible thing. Spent weekends installing a whole system of elevated rain barrels that collected from the gutters. I even added a filter and a pump. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. I kept my tomatoes alive. My sunflowers even started to turn their heads again. And Karen? Her lawn looked like a golf course in the middle of Arizona. The thing about Karen is she doesn't believe rules apply to her. She's the kind of woman who once called code enforcement because my garage door was painted eggshell white instead of HOA certified white. She leaves notes taped to people's mailboxes. I've seen her sneak around at night to snip dandelions from other yards just so her own looks more flawless by comparison. But until that morning, I hadn't realized she'd go as far as stealing water. At first, I wanted to believe it was a mistake. Maybe someone accidentally redirected their hose. Maybe a kid messed around. But then I noticed the footprints, small boot prints around my rain barrels, fresh, still visible in the soft earth. And they didn't belong to me. I took pictures, then followed the fence line back toward Karen's yard. That's when I saw the telltale drag marks, the kind a hose makes when pulled across gravel. And the kicker? A small gardening tool left behind with a cracked handle and the name Jace scratched into it. That was her nephew, a teenage boy who lived with her during the summers and once tried to charge me $10 to throw a frisbee back over my fence. I knocked on her door with the tool in hand and asked if she wanted to explain. She smiled again, like this was all one big joke, and said, "Kids get curious. Maybe it was fate your water went to good use." I didn't find it funny. My rain system had taken weeks to set up. It cost me more than I'd planned and saved me from watching my whole garden shrivel. I told her I wanted compensation. She offered me a $10 Target gift card, said that should cover it. I walked away, jaw clenched so hard I thought I'd chip a tooth. But I wasn't going to yell. Not yet. I was going to get proof. That night I set up one of my wildlife cameras, the kind that picks up motion and sends live alerts to your phone. I mounted it behind a planter and aimed it directly at the barrels. Then I waited. Nothing happened the first night. But the second night, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, my phone buzzed. I opened the feed and saw Jace creeping along the side of the fence with a flashlight. He unscrewed the cap on one barrel and stuck a siphon tube in, then dragged the other end across the yard. I watched, seething, as the water gurgled away. He took 3 full barrels. By dawn, only sludge was left. The footage was clear. There was no mistaking his face or his movements. I downloaded it, saved it twice, and printed screenshots. When I showed up at Karen's house the next morning, she opened the door mid-phone call, laughed when she saw me, and said into the receiver, "Got to go. Waterman's here." I handed her the photos and said, "This stops now." She glanced at them, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Oh please, that's not theft. That's neighborhood resource sharing." I asked if she wanted to test that logic in court. She said, "If you're so obsessed with water, Maybe you need to get a life." Then she closed the door in my face. The worst part wasn't her smugness. It was realizing she didn't think she'd done anything wrong. And that meant she wasn't going to stop. I reinforced the barrels, added locks to the caps, wrapped the hoses up high, and tied them in place. I even sprayed a line of coiled urine around the fence line. The next morning, 2 barrels had been tipped over, their sides dented. A pair of garden shears was lying beside them, the kind with yellow rubber grips. I picked them up and held them like a murder weapon. That's when it stopped being about rainwater. It became personal. Karen had turned my home into a target. She was attacking something I built with pride, with care, with the intention of doing good. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make sure she never forgot what it felt like to have something precious taken. And I wasn't going to do it with yelling or lawsuits. I was going to do it the one way Karen never expected, quietly, legally, and also very dirty. By the time I walked into the next HOA meeting, I was already expecting trouble. It was held in the community center every third Thursday, and usually no one showed up except the same 5 retired busybodies who cared more about flower bed colors than actual problems. But this time, nearly a dozen people had come, and Karen sat right at the front, legs crossed, a folder full of papers in her lap, and a smug look on her face like she was preparing to win a court case. I took a seat in the back, letting her have her moment. The meeting began with the usual updates about garbage pickup and minor landscaping issues. But halfway through, Karen raised her hand and said she had an urgent matter to present. She stood up, cleared her throat, and passed copies of a printed email to everyone. I could already feel my blood pressure rising. The letter claimed that I had violated several HOA guidelines regarding unsightly water storage, including the use of barrels that had not been pre-approved, and it questioned whether I had followed proper runoff redirection procedures. It was pure nonsense, written in that passive-aggressive tone only HOA people and middle school principals seemed to master. The president of the HOA, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, read the letter and then looked at me as if waiting for an explanation. I didn't stand. I simply said that the barrels were legal under county drought provisions and that the HOA bylaws did not require individual approval for temporary emergency collection units. Karen cut in, saying that my setup was a visual blight and a risk to children. She then held up her phone and claimed she had photos showing kids playing near the barrels unsupervised. It was an obvious ploy. There were no children, no photos, just her word and an attempt to turn the meeting into a public shaming. I stood then, slowly, and passed out my own set of images. They were stills from the wildlife cam. Jace, her nephew, caught in the act with a siphon hose, clear as day. The room fell awkwardly silent. Karen's face twitched, but she recovered quickly, saying her nephew was just curious and that I was overreacting. She then accused me of setting traps with toxic chemicals, like the coyote urine, which she said endangered pets. I reminded the room that her nephew had vandalized private property and that I had full right to deter trespassers on my land. Marcus mumbled something about needing to review everything and said they'd table the discussion. Karen glared at me, but I knew I'd won this round. Still, the fact that she had the nerve to report me even as she stole from me meant this wasn't over. After the meeting, I walked straight to the hardware store. I bought locking mechanisms for every single spout on my rain barrels, heavy-duty padlocks, tamper-proof hinges, and even a few cheap motion sensors with sound alarms. I spent that weekend reinforcing the setup like it was Fort Knox. Every barrel was now chained to a concrete block, and the covers had bolts. If Jace or Karen wanted water, they'd have to call a locksmith first. I even installed a fake security sign next to the barrels. Just seeing it there made me feel a little more in control. But the satisfaction didn't last long. 2 days later, I came out in the morning to find that 3 of my 4 barrels had been flipped over. The bolts were ripped clean off, and one of the chains had been cut with something heavy. The 4th barrel, which was the most reinforced, was intact but dented. That was when I found the shears, heavy ones with yellow rubber grips, jammed halfway into the soil like they had been dropped in a hurry. They weren't mine. I didn't even own that brand. I picked them up using gloves, just in case. I knew whose they were. I placed them in a plastic bag and walked back into my house, more calm than I had any right to be. This wasn't just water theft anymore. This was property damage, and she had just handed me a golden ticket. I didn't report it. Not yet. Karen wanted a war of words and threats. I wanted a win she would never see coming. That night, I sat down with a notebook and started sketching a plan. The one advantage I had was knowledge. Karen had no idea how water systems work. She probably thought hoses were magic, and that water just appeared because she demanded it. But I used to work summers for a plumber in my college days, and I remembered more than a few tricks. It would be perfectly legal, too, as long as I never stepped foot onto her property. That was the key: keep everything clean on my end and let her walk into her own trap. The next day, I called up an old buddy from those plumbing days. Still worked in irrigation and still owed me a favor. I explained the situation without naming names. I told him about a neighbor stealing rainwater, about the HOA drama, and about wanting to play a little prank with a message. He laughed for 10 straight minutes before saying he was in. We met at my place late that night with parts and gear. We snuck around the fence line and located the sprinkler access pipe that sat just on Karen's side. Her setup was ancient. One cracked PVC joint led directly into the control box that timed the water flow. We didn't need to break anything, just reroute. We ran a low-pressure extension line from an external sewer cleanout in my yard. No contamination, no backflow risk, just enough to alter the water source for one short cycle. We kept it tight and covered the access with dirt and leaves. The system would trigger the next time her timer kicked in, which happened every morning at 6:15. I barely slept. I lay in bed, watching the time crawl by. At 6:10, I crept outside, coffee in hand, and leaned on my fence like a man admiring the sunrise. I waited. The sprinklers clicked on. For the first 10 seconds, nothing looked different. Then it started. A sputtering noise, then a foul stench rising into the air like death had taken a bath. Brown water shot out in every direction, coating Karen's pristine hydrangeas and soaking the patio where she had set up her new white garden furniture. The smell was unbearable, even from my side. I watched as Karen burst out of her back door in a pink bathrobe, yelling, gagging, and covering her nose. I took a slow sip of my coffee, then walked back inside. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a start, and unlike Karen, I didn't need to break the rules to make my point. I just had to let her keep breaking them herself. The smell lingered for days, even after Karen hired a professional cleaning service and dumped 3 industrial buckets of bleach across her patio. A sour undertone clung to the air like a guilty conscience. Word spread fast. People walking their dogs detoured to the other side of the street. One kid on a bike gagged so hard he had to pedal away mid-cough. I didn't say a word. I didn't brag. I didn't even smirk when she walked past me on the street with a scarf tied around her face and a can of air freshener in one hand. But inside, I was enjoying every single second. For the first time since this whole feud began, I had the upper hand. The sewer stunt had worked better than I imagined, not just because it was gross, but because it shook her sense of control. Karen thrived on power, on knowing that she could make people bend to her rules. But now her green lawn was a foul shade of brown. Her guests had stopped coming over, and even her nephews stayed indoors. Her world had been disrupted by something she couldn't explain or fight without revealing what she'd done. Still, I knew Karen well enough to understand she wouldn't take this lying down. She was the type who'd rather go down swinging than admit defeat. I just didn't expect her next move to come so soon. It started when I received a notice from the city claiming that a biohazard had been reported at my property. The letter was vague, full of bureaucratic language, but the meaning was clear. Someone had reported me for allegedly contaminating residential water lines. There was only one person who could have done it. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was so wildly hypocritical. She was the one who'd stolen my water. She was the one who sabotaged my barrels. But now she was trying to paint me as the villain. I knew I had to be careful. The prank had been harmless, technically, but if it looked like I had tampered with municipal lines, I could be in real trouble. So I did what Karen never would. I prepared. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. the wildlife cam footage, the photos of the vandalism, a copy of the HOA rules. I printed timestamps of my sprinkler prank setup that proved it was self-contained and legal. I even had a plumber's invoice that showed the modifications didn't touch any city systems. When the city inspectors arrived, I greeted them with a smile and a thick folder. 2 men in tan uniforms walked through my property, checked the barrel setup, and asked a few questions. One of them even chuckled when I explained how Karen's sprinklers had mysteriously malfunctioned. They didn't say much, just nodded and took notes, but I could tell they weren't buying her story. Later that afternoon, I stood in my yard and watched them move next door. They knocked on Karen's door and disappeared inside for nearly an hour. They walked her property, checked her irrigation lines, and inspected the control box. I couldn't hear what was being said, but at one point, one of the inspectors shook his head and pointed at the cracked PVC pipe we had rerouted. Karen gestured wildly, flapping her arms like she was trying to swat a wasp out of the air. I knew that body language. She was losing control of the narrative. The next morning, I received an email from the city saying the investigation had been closed with no violations found on my end. I smiled and printed that out too, added it to my Karen folder, and filed it under Sweet Victories. But that didn't stop her. A week later, the HOA called an emergency meeting. This time, the room was packed. Word had spread, and everyone wanted to see the showdown. Karen came in wearing a blazer like she was presenting a corporate merger. I came in with my usual flannel and a thermos of coffee. As the meeting began, Karen stood up and launched into a speech. She accused me of environmental sabotage, claimed I had a history of aggressive behavior. She even pulled out a fake petition with 5 signatures demanding I be fined or banned from collecting rainwater. I let her talk, let her dig her own hole deeper and deeper. When it was my turn, I stood, thanked everyone for coming, and calmly laid out my case. I passed around the folder, let them see the photos, the timestamps, the inspection clearance, the footage of Jace siphoning water. I kept my tone cool and factual. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Then Marcus cleared his throat and said that based on the evidence, there would be no action taken against me. In fact, he added, the board would be reviewing Karen's actions and possibly removing her from the Water Ethics Subcommittee due to her conflict of interest. Someone in the room clapped. Just one person, but it was enough. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. She stood, pointed at me, and shouted that I was a manipulator and a liar, that I had poisoned her lawn and humiliated her, that I had turned the neighborhood against her. Then she stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard one of the blinds fell off the window. I took another sip of my coffee and exhaled slowly. Later that week, I noticed her garden furniture had been moved to the curb with a free sign taped to it. The once perfect grass was patchy and limp. Even her rose bushes looked like they had given up. The bright green kingdom she had bragged about all summer was falling apart. She barely came outside anymore. When she did, she avoided eye contact, walked quickly, and kept her head down. It wasn't just the smell or the lawn. It was the fact that she no longer controlled the story. Her power had come from fear and gossip, from making people believe she was untouchable. But now people whispered about her for different reasons. Her meltdown at the meeting, the viral sewer sprinkler story. The neighbors were starting to laugh behind her back instead of cowering in front of her. And just when I thought things might settle down, I heard a loud splash one afternoon, followed by a high-pitched scream. I ran outside and found Jace lying face first in my shallow pond, soaked and flailing, one of his shoes floating nearby. He had clearly tried to sneak over the fence again and slipped on the slick edge. He was fine, just muddy and embarrassed. But the best part, the wildlife cam caught every second. The video was so absurd I couldn't help myself. I uploaded it with no caption, just the title Jace Takes a Swim, and let the internet do the rest. Within a day, it had over 500,000 views. People were making remixes. Someone added rubber duck sound effects. Another added opera music. I didn't have to say anything. Karen and her crew were doing all the damage themselves. I just sat back, kept my barrels locked, and waited for whatever came next, because I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't finished. but neither was I. The days that followed were strangely quiet. Karen's yard stayed bone dry, the sprinklers completely shut off, and her usual routine of morning pacing and gossiping across fences came to a screeching halt. It was like someone had turned down the volume on her entire life. She no longer barked orders to the mailman or yelled at delivery drivers for stopping too close to her curb. Even the wind chimes on her porch seemed less aggressive, but that stillness didn't bring peace. It was the silence before the storm, and I knew better than to believe she had given up. Karen didn't surrender. She regrouped. I kept to myself, tending to my now thriving garden with my rain barrels back in operation and no more siphons showing up in the night. My plants had made a full recovery. Neighbors who used to avoid me were now waving, even stopping to ask what I had used on my tomatoes. I just smiled and said, rainwater and patience. But deep inside, I was watching, waiting for her next move. It came one morning just as I was loading tools into the back of my truck. A black SUV pulled up and parked right across my driveway. Two men stepped out wearing navy blue jackets and badges. They introduced themselves as private investigators hired to look into a civil dispute regarding property sabotage. The words were polite, but their posture was serious. I asked who hired them. It didn't say directly, but it didn't take a genius to figure it out. They asked if I had any involvement with rerouting water systems, contaminating sprinklers, or installing illegal plumbing across property lines. I asked if they had a warrant. They said no. So I smiled and told them I'd be happy to answer any questions after they received something more official than Karen's hurt feelings. That afternoon, I received a letter taped to my door, not a legal notice, not a cease and desist, just a poorly typed threat signed by a lawyer representing Karen in what she called a pending civil case. She accused me of water terrorism, emotional distress, and lawn-related trauma. The letter included an offer to settle the matter privately if I paid for the cleaning, landscaping, and a year's worth of bottled water delivery. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my coffee. I scanned the letter, circled the grammatical errors, and mailed it back with a sticky note that said, "Try again." A few days later, I heard from Marcus, the HOA president. He told me there would be another meeting to formally address Karen's position on the HOA board. Apparently, the members had reviewed the footage and the escalating complaints from neighbors. Her behavior was damaging the reputation of the neighborhood. Her outbursts, her false accusations, her willingness to drag personal vendettas into official business. Marcus didn't say it directly, but I could tell the board was preparing to vote her out. When the day arrived, the room was packed. More people than I'd ever seen at any HOA event showed up. Some were standing in the back, others sitting on windowsills just to be in the room. Karen walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a dark green pantsuit and sunglasses indoors. She sat at the end of the table with her arms crossed and her jaw clenched. Marcus opened the meeting with a calm voice, listing the agenda items. Then he got to the main event. He read through a list of grievances against Karen that spanned months, even years. Several neighbors stood up to speak. One recalled how she had fined them $300 for a bird feeder. Another told a story about Karen trespassing to trim their hedges without permission. Then Marcus mentioned the sprinkler incident, the false reports, and the harassment complaints filed against her by 2 separate households. Karen stood up and called the whole thing a witch hunt. She said she had dedicated herself to preserving the integrity of the neighborhood, that she was being punished for caring. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with rage. She called me a saboteur, a manipulator, said I had turned people against her with edited footage and lies. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The room was on my side now. People who once avoided me now nodded in agreement. Marcus finally asked for a vote. One by one, hands were raised. The motion to remove Karen from her position passed by a landslide. She didn't wait for the rest. She stormed out, slamming the door once again, this time hard enough to send a potted plant toppling from a nearby shelf. I stayed seated, hands folded, pretending to check my phone, but I felt it in my chest. That slow-burning satisfaction of justice served cold. Later that night, I saw her porch light blink on and off. Karen stood outside, ripping up papers and throwing them into her trash bin with a fury I hadn't seen before. Her perfect facade had cracked, and underneath was someone desperate and unraveling. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity, but the pity faded quickly when I discovered that someone had slashed one of my garden hoses and left a note tucked under my windshield wiper that simply said "Water Thief" in block letters. No name, no signature, just accusation. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. I didn't have proof it was her, but the pattern was too familiar to ignore. I replaced the hose and added another security camera aimed directly at the street. If she wanted to play dirty, she'd have to do it in front of an audience. A few days later, the local news came knocking. Turns out the sprinkler sewer water story had gone viral after someone reposted it to a local humor group. The reporter asked if I'd like to share my side of the story. I agreed on the condition that they didn't mention Karen by name. I wasn't interested in dragging her further through the mud. The piece aired a few days later, showing my garden, the rain barrels, and a gentle narration about water conservation and neighborhood conflict. It made me look like a quirky local hero. Viewers sent in messages of support. A conservation group even reached out to offer me a small grant to expand my rainwater system. Karen didn't say a word, not in public, not to me, but I saw the curtains shift whenever someone stopped by my yard. Then one afternoon, I stepped outside and found a package on my doorstep. No return label. Inside was a plate of cookies, slightly crushed, and a handwritten card that said, "Sorry for everything." It wasn't signed, but I recognized the handwriting. It was Karen's. I stared at it for a long time, then walked to the edge of my property and tossed the cookies into the compost bin. I didn't need apologies. I needed peace. But deep down, I knew that as long as Karen stayed next door, peace would be temporary. This wasn't a feud that would disappear. It was a cycle. And the more I tried to be civil, the more she saw it as weakness. So I tightened the locks on my barrels, rechecked the camera feeds, and reminded myself that some people water their lawns. Others just stir the mud. The calm didn't last. It never really does when someone like Karen is involved. Just when I thought she might finally settle into her well-earned obscurity, she surprised everyone with one last desperate act that sent the neighborhood spiraling into chaos again. It started subtly. I noticed new landscaping supplies arriving at her house. Bags of soil, rolls of sod, a delivery of rose bushes, and lawn edging stacked neatly on her driveway. Her yard had been dry and patchy for weeks after the sprinkler disaster, and it looked like she had finally given up and decided to revive it. But something about the way she went about it made me suspicious. It wasn't just regular maintenance. It was aggressive restoration. Everything about it screamed revenge makeover. I told myself to stay out of it, let her spend her money and sweat trying to fix what she had ruined. But the unease kept nagging at me. Then one morning, I heard the sound of a power drill and laughter. I stepped outside and saw Karen and her nephew standing near the fence line, installing what looked like a new irrigation system. Long black tubing snaked along her yard, hugging the edge of the property where it bordered mine. I leaned on the fence and watched as Jace grinned at me and gave a sarcastic little wave. Karen never looked up, but I could tell from the tension in her shoulders that she knew I was watching. Later that day, I found a puddle forming near my compost bin. At first, I thought maybe one of my hoses had sprung a leak, but when I traced it back, I realized that water was seeping under the fence from her yard. It wasn't just runoff, it was targeted. A slow leak positioned perfectly to pool in the corner where I stored tools and mulch. I could have reported it. I could have marched over and started yelling, but I didn't. I took photos, documented the puddles, noted the time and day. Then I adjusted the drainage on my side, diverted the water flow, and waited. Over the next few days, the leak stopped, but that's when something else started. My rain barrels, all locked and reinforced, began showing signs of tampering again. One morning, I found a deep scratch along the side of the largest barrel, like someone had tried to pry it open with a crowbar. Another day, I noticed the lock on the spigot had been twisted so hard it was nearly broken. Each time, I reinforced the damage, made the setup stronger, and logged everything with dates and photos. I wasn't going to let her win, but I wasn't going to play her game either, not directly. Then the video went viral, not just a few views or a local buzz, but real internet traction. Someone had clipped together footage of Karen's meltdown at the HOA meeting, her sprinkler disaster, and her nephew falling into my pond, set to dramatic music with over-the-top captions. The title read, "The Queen of HOA Falls from Grace." Within days, it had over 2 million views. People started commenting with jokes and theories. Someone created memes. A few local teens even made a parody skit where they acted out the feud using pool noodles and garden hoses. The entire neighborhood knew. Even people from the next town over were talking about it. I hadn't posted the video. I hadn't even promoted it. But someone with editing skills and a sense of humor had taken the clips from my publicly posted wildlife cam videos and done the rest. Karen was furious. She started patrolling her yard like a prison guard, pacing back and forth with her phone in hand, probably looking for any excuse to call the cops or sue someone. She even installed her own cameras, big ones, mounted on poles and aimed directly at my backyard, like she was expecting me to launch a counterattack. I ignored her. I tended my tomatoes. I read on the porch. I waved politely when delivery drivers showed up at her door and quickly walked away when she yelled at them for stepping on her walkway. Then one afternoon, something changed. I saw a moving truck. It was parked in front of her house for hours, with men loading furniture and boxes. Karen wasn't outside, but Jay stood in the driveway, watching the crew like he was guarding treasure. I didn't know if she was leaving, downsizing, or just finally giving up. I hoped for the best, but instead of peace, it brought something unexpected. That evening, just as the sun was setting, Karen came to my door. She knocked twice and waited. I opened it cautiously. She looked different, not smug or angry, just tired. Her eyes were puffy. She held out a small envelope. Inside was a printed letter, formally typed and full of hollow legal terms, informing me of her intent to pursue legal action for defamation and emotional distress. She said nothing while I read it. When I looked up, she said quietly, "This isn't over." Then she turned and walked away. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The letter wasn't a real lawsuit. It was a bluff. I scanned it, filed it in my folder with all the other evidence, and went back to watering my garden. But it wasn't the threat that stuck with me. It was the way she looked, like someone who had lost more than a battle, like someone who knew deep down that the war had turned against her. The next day, I received a call from a local news anchor who had seen the viral video and wanted to interview me for a segment on neighborhood disputes and water conservation. I agreed under the condition that they not reveal Karen's name or address. I didn't need more drama. I just wanted the story told truthfully. The interview aired a few days later. It was short, respectful, and surprisingly emotional. I talked about how the drought had pushed people to extremes, how neighbors had turned on each other, how sometimes when you're trying to do the right thing, you get pushed into situations you never expected. I ended by saying that water should bring people together, not tear them apart. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in. People offered to donate rain equipment. One local conservation group even offered to sponsor a small community workshop with me as a speaker. I declined the spotlight, but I appreciated the gesture. Meanwhile, Karen's house stayed dark. The landscaping stopped. The sprinklers never came back on. The cameras turned off. One evening, just before dusk, I found another envelope at my door. No threats this time, no return address, just a small note that said, "I'm leaving. You win." I didn't know how to feel. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't gloating. It was a strange, hollow sense of closure. I folded the note, placed it in the folder, and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet again. Birds chirped. A soft breeze rustled the trees. I checked the locks on my barrels one more time, then walked inside, knowing that sometimes justice comes not with noise or fists, but with patience, silence, and a very well-placed sprinkler line. The silence after Karen's departure was strange at first. I kept expecting to hear her voice carried by the wind, barking at some delivery guy or scolding a kid on a bicycle for riding too fast. But the house sat still, curtains drawn, driveway empty, lawn untouched. A for sale sign appeared the following week, this time a real one, with a licensed agent and a contact number that rang straight to voicemail. The listing described the property as a beautifully maintained suburban oasis with mature landscaping and custom sprinkler system. I nearly laughed when I read that part. The only thing custom about it was the way it once sprayed sewer water across an entire brunch party. But still, someone would eventually bite. People always do. A fresh coat of paint and a memory short enough to forget the drama could turn even the messiest chapter into a new beginning for someone else. I went about my life quietly, watered the garden, repaired one of the barrel stands that had cracked after the last rain. Every now and then, I caught neighbors slowing their walk to glance at the empty house, murmuring things I couldn't quite make out. Some were probably curious, others likely relieved. The tension that had clung to this street like humidity had finally lifted, and oddly enough, I started to feel something like peace, not victory, not satisfaction, just the absence of constant chaos. It was a rare and welcome thing. One morning, I stepped outside to find a small box sitting on my porch. No return label, no markings. Inside were 6 homemade cupcakes and a note written in neat cursive. It said, "Thank you for standing up for yourself and for the rest of us." That was all. No name, no signature. I smiled and brought them inside. I didn't eat them, just in case, but the gesture was enough. People had been paying attention, more than I thought, and maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand that you don't have to be loud to be right. You just have to be steady. The garden flourished that month. Tomatoes plump and bright. Sunflowers stretching tall enough to peek over the fence line. Rain had finally returned in light drizzles, enough to fill the barrels again and keep the soil soft. I added a compost bin behind the shed and started planting herbs in raised beds. My yard, once just a patch of practicality, had become something more. It felt like a symbol now, a little corner of resistance, not against authority or rules, but against the idea that being selfish and loud somehow gave someone the right to walk over others. Then came the call. A woman from the local conservation group wanted to feature my setup in their monthly newsletter, said someone had nominated me as a model for sustainable drought management. I nearly declined. I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I just wanted to collect rain in peace. But she was kind and genuinely enthusiastic, so I agreed to a small write-up. She came by with a photographer one afternoon, snapped pictures of the barrels and garden beds, even interviewed me for a few minutes. I kept it short, told her about the drought, the system I built, and how people sometimes underestimate how far you'll go to protect what's yours. The article came out the next week, titled Water Warrior. It was mostly fluff, but well-intentioned. It praised the rain system, quoted me saying something about patience being more powerful than revenge, and even included a photo of me standing beside the barrels with a faint smile. I didn't think much of it until my mailbox started filling with letters. Not hate mail, not HOA threats, but notes. Kind ones from people in nearby neighborhoods, even other towns, who had read the piece and wanted advice. Some asked about barrel brands. Others just thanked me for showing that you could win without going crazy. I answered what I could, passed on a few tips, shared my design sketches. It felt good to help, for once, without defending myself. And just when I thought the last of the Karen era had drifted off like the last leaves of fall, she reappeared, not in person, not in the neighborhood, but in a news article shared in one of the local forums. Karen was suing someone, a different HOA, a different street, same pattern. The article was vague on details, but clear enough if you knew the signs. She had moved into a new development, attempted to join the board, and within months was locked in litigation over alleged neighborhood defamation and interference with her property rights. I read it twice, then closed the page and walked outside to check on the compost. I didn't care anymore. Let her chase windmills in someone else's backyard. My war with her was over. She had moved on, and so had I. But part of me hoped that wherever she ended up, someone was ready. Someone with a good camera, a locked barrel, and a little more patience than pride. Because if there's one thing Karen taught me, it's that people like her never really change. They just relocate. That evening, I walked out to my front yard with a cup of tea and watched the sun set behind the trees. A couple of kids rode by on bikes, one of them waving at me. I waved back. A neighbor 2 doors down was grilling, the smell drifting gently across the block. Everything felt settled, like a chapter had truly ended. I thought back to how it started. One stolen barrel of rainwater, one smug shrug, a moment that could have been ignored. But I didn't. I chose to stand my ground. And now, standing there with a soft breeze brushing past my shoulders and the sound of wind chimes in the distance, I knew I'd done the right thing. I finished my tea, set the cup on the porch railing, and looked over my yard. Every inch of it was earned. Every plant, a little act of stubbornness. Every drop of water, a small victory. And for the first time in months, I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I wasn't waiting for the next move. Because the game was done, the board was cleared, and peace, however temporary, had finally returned to Karen County. The seasons changed slowly after that, the way they always do in this part of the country, where fall creeps in more like a whisper than a storm. The leaves started to lose their brightness, and the mornings grew a little quieter, the sunlight slanting in at softer angles. My garden wound down for the year, the last of the tomatoes harvested, and the herbs trimmed back into neat bundles hanging in the kitchen to dry. I drained 2 of the rain barrels in preparation for the colder nights and cleaned out the filters like clockwork. It had become part of my rhythm, one of those quiet, grounding routines that reminded me everything in life, even the chaos, eventually passes. One afternoon, I walked down to the end of the block with a bag of compost scraps and passed by what used to be Karen's house. The for sale sign had a big red sold sticker slapped across it, and the windows were open for the first time in months. New curtains fluttered gently in the breeze. A young couple was standing in the driveway, talking with a moving crew and laughing about something I couldn't hear. I kept walking, but part of me smiled. I didn't know who they were, didn't know what they did or where they came from. But I hoped they were kind. I hoped they watered their plants without stealing from others, and never thought to file lawsuits over flowers. I hoped they had never heard of Karen, and if they had, I hoped they didn't believe every story they'd heard. The neighborhood felt different now, not just quieter but lighter. People waved more. Kids stayed out longer. There was laughter instead of tension, shared tools instead of complaints. One morning, I found a basket of fresh eggs and vegetables on my porch with a note that simply said, "For your garden." It wasn't signed, and I didn't need it to be. It was enough to know someone had noticed. It was a small kindness, the kind of thing that used to define communities before people got too busy or too suspicious to bother. Maybe all the nonsense had reminded us what mattered. A few weeks later, the local conservation group asked if I would speak at a town meeting. Nothing formal, just a short segment about backyard water systems and neighborhood cooperation. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed attention, and I certainly didn't feel like any kind of expert. But then I thought about all the emails and letters I'd received, the people who had quietly thanked me for showing them that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean shouting the loudest. So I agreed. The meeting was held at the town hall on a Thursday evening. The room wasn't packed, but it was warm, and there were more familiar faces than I expected. I kept it simple. I talked about the drought, about setting up the barrels, about how you learn by doing and sometimes by failing. I told a few light-hearted stories, careful not to name names or dig up the past. The focus was on what could be done moving forward, on how small efforts could ripple out into something bigger. When I finished, a few people clapped. A woman in the back raised her hand and said she wanted help installing a similar system at her place. A man near the front asked where to buy the locking spigots, and just like that, it turned from a talk into a conversation. After the meeting, a man approached me in the parking lot. He was older, maybe mid-60s, wearing a worn denim jacket and a ball cap that looked older than both of us. He said he used to be in the trades, plumbing, mostly, but arthritis had slowed him down. He thanked me for what I said and said the world needed more people who fought back without burning everything down in the process. He said he'd lived here long enough to see a lot of neighbors come and go, and that sometimes the worst ones teach us how to appreciate the quiet ones. I thanked him. Then he chuckled and added that he saw the sewer sprinkler video and nearly choked on his coffee. I laughed too. The next morning, I woke up early and walked out into the yard before the sun had fully risen. The sky was painted in gentle streaks of gold and purple, and the air held the first crisp edge of the coming winter. I checked the barrels, all of them secure and half full from the recent rains. The grass was soft underfoot, and the leaves crackled lightly as I moved. I stood still for a moment, just listening. No shouts, no arguments, no paranoia, just birds waking up and the wind moving through the trees. It was perfect. Later that day, I decided to take down the old wooden sign I had posted months ago, the one warning trespassers of sprinkler retaliation. It had served its purpose. It had made its point. But now it just felt like a relic from a war that was finally over. I pulled it up, dusted off the base, and leaned it against the back fence near the shed. Maybe one day I'd turn it into something else. A birdhouse, a bench, or maybe I'd just leave it there as a reminder that not all battles need to be loud. Some are won in silence, in patience, in staying calm while everything around you tries to pull you into chaos. That weekend, the new neighbors hosted a small cookout. Nothing fancy, just a few chairs, a grill, and the smell of burgers drifting over the fences. They invited everyone. No formality, just knocked on doors and said, "Come by if you're hungry." I brought a jar of homemade pickles and a folding chair. It was the first time I had sat in a neighbor's yard in over a year. We laughed, swapped stories, and nobody talked about water rights or committee votes. It felt like a fresh start. As the sun went down and the string lights clicked on, I looked around at the group of people chatting and eating and thought about how far we had come. Not just me, all of us. The neighborhood had survived a storm, one of those strange ones that doesn't come from the sky, but from within. And somehow it was better for it. I stood, stretched, and said my goodbyes. As I walked home, I glanced once more at my yard. The barrels lined up neatly under the eaves, the garden trimmed back and ready for winter, the air still holding a trace of barbecue smoke. I took a deep breath and smiled, not because I'd won, not because she lost, but because for the first time in a long time, everything was still, and sometimes stillness is the sweetest kind of victory there is.